that dough.
Thank you so much. I thrifted it for $2. Isn't that crazy? Oh, I'm sorry. Did you want to say something?
What are you trying to do?
Oh my god. Oh my god. Seventh grade me would be so excited right now.
So it's just recording everyone.
Yeah, when you're saying that, like one of your friends from like undergrad actually all the time, that you don't get that here.
Yeah, I need it, honestly.
Really, the picture you posted of Indy and you as like a
You want me to
little girl,
disconnect it?
when I saw you, I like squealed. You're so.
When it is?
Oh, thank you. I really appreciate that. I need you to know, I posted that analysis, like, how many people do you think don't know that you're bald or that are gonna find out soft through this post? And I was like, I have no idea. It's gonna be at least 2 people. I didn't know that photo existed. Yeah, I need you to know, I was up here like every summer. That's the only photo I have of like me and him as a puppy. And I'm like, I don't even know who took that photo, but I know it was like a.
It's so cute.
I really
You
appreciate
look
that.
so cute.
Oh my god.
So cute.
I also love that. I appreciate that. I got bullied for it, so it's not
I'm sorry.
Where's the
Remove. That was not good. Yeah. Ziggy's on a mission.
Hi, come here.
so cute.
Oh, I get it. See, he likes you more than me.
Ziggy, wrong row. Next row. Can you go to the next one? No.
Ziggy, we'll give you so much love.
Ziggy.
Ziggy.
Have a bite of my face. You can.
This way.
Good. What? Except for Cheeto. I fear we may have.
Your mom said it was a roll. Ziggy. It's so Ziggy.
Sorry.
What should it be called?
Ziggy.
You're having a hard time.
It's like some 111
Ziggy.
tag cam or something. Yeah, it's a whole bunch of.
He's your dog and he's so sweet.
Hi, come here. Come here. Are you giving a presentation today?
Yeah, everyone Ziggy do it.
Don't
Maybe the first one.
This is a great seminar so far.
I love it.
Jenna, you're crushing it.
Oh.
He's just so curly. I have. I totally have. He used to just be walking around and then
Focus on research.
I know I smell like things.
I do kind of get.
You're really long.
That's a lot. You learn different things.
Blah 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 blah
I love
blah.
those colors. You're so fashion, Ziggy.
I just went over. You need to start.
I thought this was the second album.
Okay.
So bad.
Just looking for the hours.
Yeah.
3 minutes fucking.
I'm about to ask you.
Oh, there was this video of like a lab sitting in the bathroom.
I would definitely door
It was really
didn't have that
Dogs
many.
get along with like cows and horses, so I would imagine they'd be like, you're wet, but it's like, okay.
Probably the best. That's so true.
You're gonna be.
I am already.
I can't not.
And you'd be like, once you get home,
Which is very.
Yeah, last weekend I ended up.
Watch them.
I saw that picture of you when I was like, I'm gonna screenshot it and make it her profile or her contact photo.
To go watch
That's
the
okay.
re-release. Changes. You know, you can just EDR. And you can watch it live. Thanks very much for that. Talk about the wood.
Slowly rolling, but it's good. That has been acting.
Like that. I have some. It's expensive, but probably I gotta be honest.
If you haven't signed in, you're taking the class. Alright, hello everyone. So today we have CCOM's Jenna Hare to present. I'm going to read her bio. Jenna is starting January. Is going to be a research assistant professor. Yes, it already is. Starting January. Oh,
Yeah.
right. Past year. So congratulate her as well. So Dr. Jenna Hare is a research assistant professor with the Center for Acoustics Research and Education, as well as CCOM. Her research interests lie at the intersection of the fields of physical oceanography and underwater acoustics, with a focus on seafloor acoustics, sediment transport processes, and bottom boundary layer dynamics. Dr. Hare completed her bachelor's in physics at Laval University in Quebec, followed by her master's and PhD in oceanography at Dalhousie University in Nova Scotia. Please welcome.
Thank you, and thank you for coming here to, I think, the second last seminar of this series. So today I'll be talking about seafloor scattering. This is work that I've been working on for the last 2 years with Tony and Gabe, who are in the room, as well as built upon Matthew Guitar's master's work that was Tony's previous master's student. And so the title, other than being a clever alliteration, at least I think so, let's break it down. Sound and the seafloor. So I'm going to be talking about how sound interacts with the seafloor at high frequencies, really specifically seafloor scattering. And in the shifting sediments part, well, I'm interested in what kind of environmental parameters are moving that sediment around and how does that influence seafloor scattering. So let's take a moment and remind ourselves that the seafloor is complicated. I think sometimes we think of these idealized systems where you have a slab of sediment with one grain size, one material, and it's flat. And that's fine, but in reality, it's actually very complex. So here we've got 2 images that you'll see throughout my talk that from 2 of our sites. This one has a range of grain sizes. You have shell hash, you've got rocks, all sorts of stuff. Here we've got 2 grain sizes, maybe some fine stuff and some larger stuff, shells and I don't know, other things that we might not always know what they are. And then within the sediment volume, here I've got a picture from a publication, 2017 publication, showing these tube worm casings. So you can also have a lot of biological activity within the sediment volume, and that'll change the properties of the seafloor as well. Seafloor is not flat. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. So here I've got a nice fan beam image from a publication, a previous publication, showing these bed forms that are created. So that's going to influence how the sound is kind of bouncing off the seafloor, at what angle that it's hitting the seafloor. And the seafloor changes. It is a dynamic environment. It is not static. So even if it had bed forms one day, it might not have bed forms another day. So here's actually an example of hydrodynamic activity at one of our sites. You can notice it's somewhat flat here. This is November 2020. Coarse material distributed somewhat evenly across the seafloor. A couple months later, January, you've got these bed forms that have set up, coarse sediment collecting the troughs of these bed forms. So all these questions of how will that affect the sound scattering off the seafloor? We also have biological activity that changes with time. Here's an example of another site, and it's got a bunch of plant matter and some fish and probably other stuff going on that we can't see. And then 1 month later, the sea looks different. How will that affect seafloor scattering? So we have all these questions, and we don't fully know how to answer all of them. I think I have another biology example from a publication, Hare 2008. This is an example of some triggerfish making pits in the seafloor. So that's going to also affect the roughness or the shape of the seafloor. So whether you have biology that, like, I'm not a biologist, so, broad term of biology, but, fish or what larger creatures kind of affecting the shape, or maybe creatures within the seafloor changing the composition as well. So taking now a turn thinking about sonars. In the ocean, active sonars or systems are used for a variety of purposes. Navigation, monitoring animals, benthic mapping, detecting objects, seabed classification. But the performance of these sonar systems really depends on the acoustic properties of the seafloor, which I've already kind of named a few, whether it's the roughness of that sediment-water interface, the presence and the activity of biological organisms, any discrete components, which could be larger rocks or larger shells, obviously the bulk properties of the sediment and any heterogeneity within the sediment volume. And as I've said, often these are assumed to have no temporal dependence. And that's likely not true in many areas, and likely not true in shallow water areas where it's a very dynamic environment. And so there's actually very few studies that have focused on temporal variations of seafloor scattering. So I've got a couple here, some very short time series of less than 2 months. And then in the literature, you've also had some others who've made a measurement and then come back a certain number of days or months later to kind of compare. And that's great, that kind of shows that foundation, but we really need more. We need longer time series to really start thinking about what environmental mechanisms are at play and what's affecting seafloor scattering over different timescales as well. And so that's the goal of this project, was to measure seafloor scattering over long periods using high frequency active acoustic systems, and try and tease out the kind of the dependence of seafloor scattering on evolving environmental parameters. And so here's our study sites. We're off the coast of New Hampshire. This is Newcastle, so we had deployments here in the mouth of the Piscataqua River, and also at Star Island, located in the Isle of Shoals. And so these are two interesting sites. Newcastle, shallower, kind of 9-meter depth, versus Star Island, average about 20-meter depth. Finer sediment in general, 300 micron median grain size. Star Island, coarser sediment, closer to a millimeter. You got a tidally dominated area, and here at Star Island, a lot of wave activity. And so we actually have 3 deployments, data from 3 deployments at Newcastle, a shorter deployment that was a couple weeks at the beginning, was kind of a test deployment, and then some longer deployments, April to June, so you got a spring deployment, and then a more of a winter deployment. And even though you're trying to get back to the exact same spot every time we pick it up and put it back down, you can notice that the seafloor does kind of look different as well. So even if you're within 10 to 20 meters of that original spot, things are different. And then at Star Island, we have a winter deployment, so fall to winter, I guess spring, November to April, and then a summer fall deployment as well. And so I did throw up some grain size distributions here. So we have one of the Star Island sites in Newcastle, some grab samples of the surface sediment were taken and processed. And so this is a typical way we look at grain size, kind of a fraction, a percentage fraction as a function of, you can think of this in our normal meters, millimeter way to think about it, or what's often used for grain size distributions is phi, which is just a logarithmic way of thinking of the grain sizes. And so the main thing I want to note here is that the Newcastle grain size distribution is bimodal. You've got some like larger pieces here and kind of a narrower peak, and then a broader grain size distribution at Star Island. That's the one with like all the shell pieces and the shell hash as well. Okay, so how do we make these measurements? Well, this tripod was designed, and you've got this beautiful picture taken by Tony, sitting out in the back here, and what do we have on it? We have downward-looking echo sounders, so these are Kongsberg transducers, and they're basically pointing at a patch of seafloor a couple meters away, if you kind of think about that. So about 2 meters high, patch of seafloor, and it's going to look at that patch of seafloor for the time of the deployment. We also have a CTD on that, so to give us water properties as well as wave properties, a forward-looking camera so we can look at what's going on, and then a downward stereo camera pair. And then it's the brains, so the transducers are connected to the WBAT, it's a wideband autonomous transceiver, so that's the battery and the brains controlling those transducers. So we've set it up to ping 50 pings every hour on the hour, and those pings are averaged. And so the data set, this was a huge data set. When I got here, it's great. I had all of this data to play with and tease out some interesting things. So we have 7 deployments, shortest one of 6 days, longest one 151 days. So we have about 375 days of data covering over 2 years from 2020 to 2021. So let's look at some results. So this is for one of the Newcastle deployments. Did I mention, I got too excited. 3 frequencies, that's the important thing. So yes, there's 2 transducers. One of them is a 70 kilohertz split beam transducer. The other one is a combi football shaped transducer. So it's sending out at 38 and 200 kilohertz. So we're gonna look at the 70 kilohertz data. So let's orient yourselves. This is time. So this is one of our Newcastle deployments. So we're going from May to whatever this should be. So maybe August, July, I guess. And then this here is distance away from the tripod. So think about it, this distance along the seafloor. And to think about it, we also tend to think in terms of grazing angles. So here, that's the grazing angle. Grazing angles will decrease as you're going further away from the tripod. And the color is, you can think of that as the acoustic response of the seafloor. It's the unaveraged interface scattering strength. And here I've plotted the significant wave height measured by the CTD during that same time. Those are, the black line is a daily moving average. So wave activity, pretty low. And this is kind of similar color. We're not seeing any like cool trends yet. So I'm showing you this kind of the boring site. But this is way more exciting, and I feel like the colors are even better on that back screen, but well, yeah, you can see. But so this is the Star Island site. This is the site that has all the shell hash and all the fun sediments. So it's a longer deployment as well. This is a winter deployment, so from November all the way to June or May, I guess. Color again, on average interface scattering strength, 70 kilohertz. This is distance away from the tripod. We can think of it in terms of grazing angle. And we've got our wave activity during this period. Not constant like the previous one. Lots of storm events. Kind of you got big storm event, then kind of calm, another big storm event, and so on. And a humongous storm event occurring in early February. And so here we've got pictures of a nearby lighthouse during that storm event with these huge waves crashing onto the lighthouse. So kind of giving you an idea of scale, but massive storm event. So what else do we see here? These are the two pictures that I showed you at the beginning of the talk. Oh, yes.
Sorry, can you remind me what water depth you're in?
Yes, this would be about 20 meters, 25
Yeah,
meters.
sorry, yeah.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, the previous one was 9 meters. So, yeah, eventually I should also put a water depth thing, but
You probably-
too many things to show, but yeah. Okay, yeah, so this image was taken at the beginning of this deployment, somewhat flat seafloor-ish. And then after the series of storm event, you've got these bed forms that have been set up. And unfortunately, camera dies for 45 days in, so we don't have any photographs here. But this is where we expect humongous bed forms to be formed because we're seeing these kind of like striations in the acoustic response that we believe is due to the presence of those bed forms. Yeah, and so the cameras also are only taking one picture a day. Sometimes sorry, I don't know, IT, there's something. Oh. I touched it.
Just comes up,
Unich.
it just comes up at random.
Yeah.
Okay.
Microsoft is really trying to push that.
Okay, bed forms, I think I said all I wanted to say, thinking train of thought, I guess it'll come to me. Yeah, so anyway, there's a lot of interesting things happening here, and we're gonna look at it in a bit more detail. But first, we can actually dive into the seafloor elevation a little bit more. So this is the same plot we were looking at before, the on average interface scattering strength. You got your significant wave height, but this is an estimate of the seafloor elevation. And we can get that since there's 70 kilohertz is a split beam transducer, divided into different sectors. We can determine what the seafloor topography is by comparing the phase of the signals received by each sector. Now this is of course just, if I'm the tripod and I'm looking this way, this is only the topography in that section. And so I'm making a lot of assumptions that it's the same throughout, but that's still pretty good and giving us an idea here. So looking at the topography, we can see that, hey, somewhat flat at the beginning, you got these maybe bed forms being set up and then massive storms, you definitely have these, this elevation change. And so that's what the color here is, elevation. So even a little bit more in detail, I've taken these 5-day averages of the elevation or the topography at 4 different times throughout the deployment. So yeah, somewhat flat-ish at the beginning. And then you're starting to get some kind of maybe little bed forms created, and then some larger things, and later after that massive storm, these pretty big bed forms. So you get about 1.5 meter wavelength, crest to trough about 20 centimeters, so non-negligible, and that will affect kind of the grazing angle, the angle at which the sound will scatter off the seafloor. So, to actually measure scattering strength is actually an ensemble average quantity. So we actually have to take an ensemble average of this color here, of the unaveraged interface scattering strength. And what's usually done is we usually would average over different but statistically equivalent patches of seafloor. So if you're in a ship, you kind of go along and you'll average a certain number of things together, and that'll be your scattering strength. But we can't do that here because we're looking at the same patch of seafloor for the whole 6 months or a couple months or whatever. And so what we can do is maybe cheat a little bit, but average over a certain number of samples. We've chosen 25 here at a grazing angle of interest. So we take samples that are all at similar grazing angles and kind of say, okay, good enough, and average over that. And so if the seafloor is flat like this, then you got larger grazing angles closer to your tripods, lower grazing angles further away, and you would just kind of take a box and average over that. But we also know it's not flat, so that will affect your grazing angle. So what I do is I pick the 25 grazing angle, I calculate the local slope from the seafloor topography previous slide, take 25 samples at similar grazing angles. So it won't necessarily be the box anymore, it'll be throughout at different ranges, but all have similar grazing angles. So all this to say, I take into account the local seafloor topography that will affect kind of the grazing angle of the sound scattering off. So let's look at some time series, because that's really more what we want to get into here. So this is at Newcastle. This is our spring-summer deployment. The colors here, these three colors, are our scattering strength at 30 kilohertz, 70 kilohertz, and 200 kilohertz. The little dots that you probably almost can't see are your hourly measurements, and what I've done with the solid lines is a daily moving average. And this purple here with the right vertical axis is our significant wave height. So you can see that, yes, it does kind of wiggle a little bit, but that's within our uncertainty bounds. That's what the gray shading is, and it's kind of somewhat constant on average throughout the whole deployment. And this is also when we didn't have a lot of storms during this deployment. This was at Newcastle, so it's more sheltered from the storms. Looking at Star Island, so this is the deployment with all the shells, all the storm activity. So right, we got this series of storm event, our massive storm here, and then more kind of calmer period afterwards. So you see, yes, there's variability, but things are changing a lot more. And I've kind of drawn two boxes here to draw your eye that we can start thinking about over on longer time scales. You got a change of up to 8 dB, depending on what frequency you're looking at. And this is all at one grazing angle. So the grazing angle kind of 11 degrees, kind of further away than if you were closer in. So this is interesting. There's variability, and we think it's related to storm activity. So yes, so I was talking about this is just for one grazing angle. But what we want to do, what is often done in literature, are these angular response curves. So you're looking at scattering strength as a function of grazing angle. So that's what I'm going to do next, is I'm going to average between storm events. For example, here, we'll average the scattering strength, and this for 11 degrees. We'll do this for other grazing angles as well. And you would get something looking like this. Average scattering strength is a function of grazing angle. And we can see that you get lower scattering strengths at lower grazing angles compared to higher grazing angles. This is what we expect from models, which we'll talk about. But this is during then this period between two storm events. So yeah, so let's take a look, take a step back from the data and think about the models and how we can compare our measurements to that. So I'll be using the small slope approximation model with elastic seafloor. And so it predicts that the scattering strength is a function of grazing angle. It looks a little bit like this. And the main inputs to this model are average seafloor property. So basically the density, the bulk density of the seafloor, and the sound speed within the seafloor. And these, in our case, well, we have a measured grain size. There are equations in the literature that relate the grain size to these density and sound speed. So that's what we'll use for now, and it's good enough for now. But the other thing that also this model depends on is the roughness of the sediment water interface. And when I'm talking about roughness here, I'm not talking about the big, large bed forms. So that's kind of changing that local slope. Here, I'm talking about the much smaller scale roughness at the scale of the acoustic wavelength. So what's actually affecting the sound kind of scattering off from that interface. And well, we can have an estimate of this. We can measure this because I have cameras and there are known algorithms to do this. But we expect this model to probably underestimate seafloor scattering because it doesn't take into account a bunch of other stuff, including, let's say, large discrete scatterers, which you've seen from the pictures. There are big rocks and shells. It also doesn't include the effect of shells or other things, but it's a good starting point. And let's see how the data fares. So first, let's talk about how I computed the roughness. So here is an image of the seafloor. So this is the downwards looking camera that's on the bottom of the tripod. And it's a stereo camera. So you get two cameras. One's looking slightly to one angle and the other one is slightly to the other angle. And they're basically going to look almost the same, the picture. And there are algorithms that you can use to compute a digital elevation map. Now, to do this, to be able to convert to a digital elevation map, you got to make sure that your cameras are calibrated, Tony. This is what I want to make sure with you. So Gabe, I think Gabe's the one, Tony.
I need to crawl out from under the bus.
Yeah. So I was told that, everything, Gabe had done all the work of calibrating these cameras and everything beautifully in the tank, and then when they're putting it together, Tony's like, oh, what does this do? And kind of started, I don't know, playing with
Starts
it.
taking it apart.
Start to take it apart.
Take it apart.
And so then Gabe had to calibrate it like in situ in the cold water, I think.
Back to the challenge.
Yeah, so I'm sad I missed that. But yeah, so you need calibrated images. I think also what turned out, the cameras were also only calibrated once, and from taking things apart and putting it back together, it turns out that the photographs from all the other deployments weren't just good, and it was too noisy to do this. So unfortunately, well, we only had the first deployment camera data for this, but that's good. It's still good. It's still something we can do with. And the important thing is on the next lander, I wrote in Sharpie on the lander, do not touch Tony. We did take a picture, but I wanted to add it here to that. So make sure you calibrate cameras, and if you do it often is always a good choice. Okay, so you've got your cameras. Oops. You got your cameras, you convert to a digital elevation map, and this looks pretty good. You got this rock here, and there's the rock here, so I feel pretty confident about that. And then you can use a 2D fast Fourier transform to get a height spectral density level. So I'm plotting here as a function of spatial wave numbers. And so if you had a lot of ripples, something like that had a regular, like a regular wavelength, then you would have blobs of energy that would appear at those, related to those wavelengths. But we have kind of a blob of energy in the middle. You average this, do a 2D or a radial average, and that's this line here. So we've got our height spectral density level as a function of spatial wave number, so it's proportional to frequency. And I've shown here in these pink bars, those are the wave numbers that correspond to the acoustic wavelength of my three frequencies, the 38, 70, and 200 kilohertz. And that's for one image. So I did this for all my images for that deployment, the first Newcastle deployment. And I've averaged those together, that's this black line. And so what's often done in the scattering models is assume that this line follows a power law. So this is the red line, I fit a line here. We're in log space, so I'm fitting a line. This is log space, this is dB, but we're fitting a line here. And so the slope of this line and the intercept of the red line are these parameters, and that's what we feed our scattering models. So the gamma 2 is the slope, the spectral slope, omega 2 is the spectral strength. So my first question was, well, do these numbers make any kind of sense? Let's compare them to what measurements exist out in the literature. And so that's what I plotted here. These are our spectral slopes. So the slope of the line is a function of the spectral strength. And my measurement here from that deployment is right here with this star. And in all the other blue markers are measurements that I could find in the literature. Most of these are reported in Jackson Richardson's book. And the color, I've done the color as a function of the grain size. So I wanted to know if there was any dependence on grain size. I'm not seeing any clear trend there. And I've also used different marker types, whether it was sand or rippled or sand and shellfish or whatever, and not really seeing any like clear trend there, other than the slope is related to that strength. So there's a bit of a trend. So even though our measurements are way down here, at least it falls along this slope. So this feels like it's in the realm of possibilities. And I'll note that this measurement was in very shelly sand as well. And I was like, okay, that sounds interesting. And so let's feed all of these roughness parameters as well as some density and like reasonable values for density and everything like that into the small slope approximation model. And so this is the scattering strength as a function of grazing angle. And all of the blue lines are all of the models for using different roughness parameters from here. And so you can see, first off, there's a huge range. It's kind of what's coming back. There's like, yes, we have a range of roughness, but that range of roughness translates to a huge range in scattering strength. And interestingly enough, our measurement, which is the pink star, lies within that range. So I felt pretty good about this. I'm like, okay, we're getting some kind of decent measurement of the roughness, and it's giving us predictions of the scattering strength that makes some kind of sense. What's left to do? Well, let's compare this pink line from the model to our actual scattering strength measurements. And so there's a lot going on here, but we'll walk through it. But that's what I'm showing here. So scattering strength, the function of grazing angle. This column is 38 kilohertz. Middle column, 70 kilohertz, 200 kilohertz. This is only for the Newcastle deployment. So you've got your 3 Newcastle deployments. I've got the significant wave height down here, kind of showing you times throughout the 2 years when those were collected. And so the circles are all our measurements. I've broken up some of the deployments into 2 or 3 or 4 parts. Let's see, and so if let's look at just this top panel here, I've got the black line is the prediction using our measured roughness parameters. And at 38 kilohertz, great. I mean, that's amazing. I feel like I just drew that on. I think that's what Tony said. He's like, oh, did you fake this data? So it looks quite good. I'm quite happy. We got the data is showing kind of that, or the model is predicting that overall trend as well as the level. So that's quite good. We're doing pretty well at 200 as well. A little bit under predicting at 70 kilohertz, but we also know that that's what we expected if there were large shell pieces and stuff. So we're still not that far off, and it at least is predicting kind of that trend that we're seeing. The dashed lines are if I fit the model to the data, and that's what the roughness parameters I should use. That's what this dashed line is, because for the other deployments, I didn't have measured roughness parameters. So I picked some that made some kind of sense that would fit the data the best. And so for the other Newcastle deployment and the last one here, again, in general, the levels are well predicted. You've got kind of that trend of like the decreasing scattering strength with decreasing grazing angle, but it's not perfect. And we know that the model is missing some things, but it's pretty good. And it's also interesting to see, for example, like this deployment here, when I've broken it up between different times, the angular response is fairly similar throughout the deployment. No CTD malfunction during this deployment, so that's why we don't have any CTD measurements for that. Let's look at the Star Island deployment. So this is the top panel is the ones with all the bed forms and the shells, the series of storms, so that's our significant wave height. And so each color here corresponds to the average between storm events so that's what I'm showing there. The bottom panel here is our summer deployment as well as this other Star Island deployment. And so this looks, let's look at this one first. 38 kilohertz, pretty good, fitting pretty well. Interesting, that's a little bit flatter than what the model predicts at the higher frequencies. This is interesting too, that we're seeing the 70 kilohertz much higher than the model, same as we were seeing in Newcastle, but not at all deployments. Don't really know why that is. Could be due to the shells, that's kind of our thought. And also at 38 kilohertz, you're seeing that range of scattering strength, whereas at the 70 and 200 kilohertz, they're more similar throughout the deployment. So a lot of interesting things here going on, but we can compare this to other measurements. So now I'm going to put all of our measurements on one plot. So average scattering strength, grazing angle, and now the color will just be each deployment. So the browns are the Star Islands and the blues are Newcastle. And I need to drink, but you can admire that while I drink. And okay, so you can see huge range just during one deployment up to 8 dB. But we can compare this to measurements provided in the literature. So I went in the literature and extracted all these measurements. This is in sediment of 120 microns to 650 microns, so similar size to our measurements, sand size sediments, though the Star Island is much coarser, is about 1 millimeter, right? So coarser than the Newcastle. But even in the data, even in sand size sediment, there's a huge range, about 20 dB. And we can start teasing some apart, but at least this, I know for this data set at the top, was actually a very fine sand, but then a layer of live shellfish on top. And so you start to get into these questions of how do you even give like a median grain size for something like that? And how do you even categorize that? Is it shell, is it sand, and what are those effects? And so I've also plotted here, so this is our prediction using kind of like standard densities and roughnesses for different sediment types that are proposed in literature. So sandy gravel, coarse sand, medium sand, fine sand. These are all sands, but you can see kind of this range of the predictions. But they all kind of predict this kind of downward trend, and a lot of the data is showing that, though some of the data sets are a little bit flatter than what the model predicts over these grazing angles. And so we can do the same exercise at 70 kilohertz. Unfortunately, at that frequency, I could only find one other set of measurement. So we're within the range, I guess, but higher than what was found in Williams et al. 2002. More measurements at 200 kilohertz, and a huge range now from, and these are still kind of similar sized sands, but this bottom one here was actually very smooth fine sand. Divers went in and smoothed the sand as best as they could by hand. And then they went and put some, like, I think marbles or shells or something, and that increased the roughness. And so those measurements kind of came up here when they increased the roughness. So it's really, we know that roughness is going to affect the scattering strength, and we're seeing it here. And then this stuff here, coarse sand and shells. So, but almost all of those literature measurements have some kind of quantity of shell in them. So there's still a lot more work to be done to understand the influence of shells and different grain sizes and the roughness of that interface. And so finally, I want to think about this data, kind of show it in a different way. So we've been thinking about scattering strength versus grazing angle at a single frequency, but let's think of its dependence as a function of frequency and grain size. So what I'm going to do is take all of the data that is at somewhat, I think 22 degrees grazing angle, so all the data contained here at all the frequencies that I've found in the literature, and plot like so. So here we've got scattering strength, and this I've plotted as a function of KD, D being the grain size, K is the wave number in water. So this is proportional to frequency. So increasing frequency, increasing grain size towards the right, and then scattering strength. And right now I plot the color as the grain size, just to kind of see that there is a trend of increasing grain size as well this way, but you can also start to see that once you take into account the ratio between the grain size and the wavelength, it's not a perfect trend. You've got like lighter colors here compared to like the darker colors there. But there is some kind of trend in the scattering strength if you squint a little bit. So now those markers are gray. I've added hour markers on top to see where they fall, and they fall along this general trend. We can add our model predictions that kind of, again, predict this model, show this general trend, but don't explain any of like the variability, the smaller scale variability. And even in some of the literature measurements, you see kind of not a definite increase, you kind of see some variability with frequency. And I can also throw onto that measurements of fine stuff, some silts, and the prediction for the scattering strength of silts for the interface is down here. And that's because I've glossed over volume scattering. I have not included any volume scattering in any of these plots. We're only talking about the scattering from the interface. But with the fine sediment, we expect volume scattering to be important, and that's something that would have to be included as well. And so kind of a couple take homes here of things that aren't taken into account in a lot of these models. I mean, it's also even just difficult to even measure them, but broad grain size distributions or bimodal distributions, the presence of discrete scatterers. I mean, at what point do we say, okay, this shell is this big rock or shell or whatever is a discrete scatterer, but at what size is it just part of the bulk sediment, and when is it still a discrete scatter? And I think those are still interesting questions to think about. And then finally, patchiness. We know that these particle sizes will probably not be evenly distributed along the seafloor. Especially, I can see it right now at one of our sites. We've got the coarse stuff within the troughs of these sediments, and we know that the seafloor can change temporally and spatially. So there's still so many more questions that to be answered. So we need more measurements and more ground truth measurements as well to really tease apart some of the different contributions. So just end on a couple next steps. I think Tom was telling me that it was really funny because he gave the first seminar in the fall talking about putting together this lander and deploying it. And we are actually going to go pick it up in about 2 weeks. So kind of ending with going to pick this up, we'll have a whole new data set to look at and think about. So his lander is a much more beefed up version. It's got the same frequencies, but also an ADCP, so we can get actual water velocities. It's kind of in the back looking up, a better camera system, and is deployed for 9 months in deeper water. And so that's exciting to pick that up soon. And then we also have a new version, a shallow water version that we have just sent off to the machine shop and is being machined. So this builds upon Tom's design. But what I'm really interested in with this project is to look at the spatial variability as well as the temporal variability. So you'll notice that we have 2 sets of downward looking sonar. So I can see, is the scattering strength from this patch of seafloor the same as this patch of seafloor just a few meters away? And especially if you have these big bed forms, are they changing? How will that affect things? We'll have the ADCP. I've also got an ADV looking down to get near bottom velocities and better camera system as well. So finally, in summary, this data set is just very cool. We've got multiple long time series, weeks to months of seafloor scattering, which I've shown you at the beginning of the talk that just didn't really exist before this. We see that seafloor scattering varies a lot. So at one site, we've seen changes up to 8 dB. And looking at the literature, even at similar sediment sizes, you can have variations of up to 20 dB. And in general, the small slope approximation model does a pretty good job of predicting the overall shape and scattering levels, but they don't capture all of the variability that we've observed. And so that means that these are kind of caveats for remote seafloor characterization. We have to think that there are many sources of variability depending on your site. And I hope I've convinced you that mean grain size isn't always an indicative of scattered levels. I think we have to start thinking about how do we incorporate other sediment parameters and how that affects seafloor scattering. So there's still a lot of work to be done in this field, and a lot of us here at UNH is working on that. And so we've got 2 articles on this, one that was published in the fall and another one that's in review now, was showing this work. But thank you all, and I'll happily take any questions now.
Yeah, so great talk. So you talked a lot about obviously grain size and how that might not be the best indicator
Yes.
of the surface scattering. So what other properties are you thinking of about the sediment?
I think I need to talk to you about that. I think that's a good question. I think
Because the one that comes to mind immediately for me is shape.
yes.
There's a way to actually characterize shape.
If you can get shape, because that's going to affect the porosity. It's going to affect also the rough. I think roughness is really important. I'm glad that we're looking more into that, but that depends potentially on, at least on the type. I think understanding more how different types affect roughness. I think the shape, but I also think the distribution. So if we could get statistics about the distribution and incorporate that into the models, I think that would be good too.
What do you mean by shape? Like grain size?
Like the angularity, like particle angularity. It's just like, for example, even like the picture you had on the slide, like the previous one, I think.
Yeah.
Like just looking at that, like you're saying just shell fraction and probably just characterizing like the grain size of that shell fraction. But even just from this, you can clearly tell there's a lot of different shapes and angularities that are happening of those individual particles that inevitably going to be, I would assume, impacting your scatter response.
I mean, even the first level is we don't even understand how shells impact scattering strength. So Haley's looking into that in the lab, which I think is going to be very exciting and has some ways of using photogrammetry to look at shell distribution, cell size distributions, which is also something that's difficult to characterize as well.
And she's looking at you.
Yeah, so.
Would bulk density be another property that would be of importance, especially if you're concerned about volume scattering and penetration?
Yeah, so I think at the lower frequencies, yes, I think anything about the medium.
Could you get anything out of a free fall penetrometer? That's what Julie really want to ask.
I think more ground truth on all of the properties of the sediment can only help our understanding. But I think that the other side of it is the modelers, how do we incorporate those into the models as well? So I think there's multiple steps and avenues to think about this.
Great talk, Jenna. Can you confirm that for each frequency you didn't change the pulse length between deployments?
Yes, that was the same, 256 microseconds.
I've seen people do that.
Oh, Tony has a quick comment.
The question.
Oh, a question?
So I think we kind of showed that in general, and I think other papers have shown this, there's a huge spread, right, in the scattering strength for even just what we call a sand. So I think you've shown, other papers have shown that the models are not too bad if you exclude shell pieces. They're not too bad. We can actually do what we need. The problem is that we're not always going to have a stereo camera system that someone hasn't broken out there measured. So the question is, you come from a lab where studying fine scale sediment movements was kind of their thing. So you think there's a way to tie roughness estimates, not just to bed forms for single grain sizes, but for the things we're interested in? Can you tie hydrodynamics and biological activity, if you know what animals are out there, to better estimates? Because that's the only way I see that you're going to be able to use this.
I agree. I think that's why I'm excited about having more water velocity measurements and start thinking about it in terms of sediment transport. So thinking about the shear stress and the turbulence near the bottom and how that actually affects how the motion of the sediment at those scales is affecting the roughness. And so I completely agree with you that needs to be thought in that way. That answers your question or comment. Maybe.
I know where your office is.
Yes, we can.
Yeah, I think I was asking a similar question. So, I mean, it's clear all the things you presented. And looking at a fine scale at a given angle, but I'm just thinking today, not 20 years from now, but looking at backscatter in a multi-beam survey in the grid size, even 50 centimeters is a pretty good grid size. Is this transferable? I know it's not a good indicator, or a 1-to-1 ratio, but is there a way, how do we approach improving that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, ideally, you also need lots of landers everywhere to look at spatial coverage, but you're also talking about the different spatial scales. And so one thing that's interesting, Khan's project, he's got his lander in one spot, and then with John, they've gone over it with an EK, a single beam with a ship. And so I think it's gonna be interesting to he's getting some pretty promising results of comparing his tripod measurements to the scattering strengths from the ship. So I think that kind of goes along to answering your question.
I'm thinking in terms of like if you're doing a multi-beam survey, you really can do it fairly high resolution with slow speeds. And if you could use the bathymetry to characterize or better characterize the setups besides knowing something about the grain size and so on. So it could be, the backscatter would be a better predictor.
Yeah.
What the bottom composition.
Yes, yeah, so I think the bathymetry will give you some idea and affect that grazing angle as I discussed, but yeah, having that backscatter will lead to better C4 characterization, I think, for sure.
I was wondering, so I was thinking about like if you were measuring like backscatter, like doing like from bathymetry perspective, like it seems to me, especially if you're looking at like a like a power spectrum of the different sizes of grains containing the sediment, that you might run into a problem with like, once you get into like beyond the large pieces for like smaller grains, that it can kind of just start looking like noise. And I was wondering did you run into any ambiguity with at small level grain sizes between being like looking at like small grains versus just, I guess I'm asking like how much of a limiting factor it is when the variability within the surface is smaller than sort of like the ability.
Are you talking about
certain.
the stereo camera stuff, or? I'm not following your question.
I mean, like in terms of like maybe I'm misunderstanding how you're measuring grains. Like if you're measuring grain size, maybe I have to think about what I'm asking. I'll see you later. I guess
The resolution of the cameras versus the size of the grains.
yeah, or just like if you, I wonder if there's any ambiguity between like any ambiguity when it gets to small grain sizes, because of course they're small, that discerning how like their effects versus just like the random effects that you get from like noise. Yeah.
So we're not measuring the scattering strength from a single grain size. It's the scattering from that patch, which will depend on the properties of the seafloor, including the grain size.
Yeah.
Is that, but I think for the camera stuff, you do want to get like a higher enough resolution to be able to resolve the roughness at the acoustic wavelengths that you care about. I don't know if I fully understand your question, but we can talk afterwards.
I think more.
Is it possible to get an idea of sediment size distribution by using that 2D Fourier of your photogrammetry and use that distribution to model instead of a mean grain size?
I think you would at least, you could say like big stuff, small stuff, but if your pixel, I mean, it depends on the resolution of your camera, right? So our cameras don't necessarily, the grains are smaller than the pixels, but you can get a couple grains in each pixel. So I think you can get an estimate of like bigger stuff, but that's also the stuff just at the surface.
There's also to answer, to follow up on that, there are ways to be able to like, to segment your images. Like you basically drawing boundaries around your grain sizes out of those photos.
But you can't get,
No,
you can't get this,
no,
that's what I'm
no.
saying. You can get an idea of this for sure. If you can see it, then you can draw a boundary around it, or you can tell MATLAB to do it.
Yeah.
But not
Well, yeah,
the fine
but
stuff.
if your pixel is small enough, instead of thinking of specific grain size, you just think of a range and a spectral density within that range.
Like that kind of relates to my question, like as a spectral
high
density.
frequency energy kind of idea. You don't care about a specific grain size, but within a resolvable range of grain size. How much
So
of
the
it?
high spectral density gives you get that as a function of spatial wave number.
Yeah.
So
But if you have very fine grains, you have high frequency.
yeah, but it gives you all the frequencies, right? When I'm plotting it, it's both the high frequency and the low frequencies. And I only care about the frequencies that are similar to my acoustic frequencies, if that makes sense. So
This is actually kind of my question. Like how you disambiguate if you were to do that kind of
Frequencies that are
so it's the
frequencies that are bigger.
I care about the Bragg wave numbers that are similar to my acoustic, like the acoustic wavelength needs to be similar to my spatial wavelength. Those are the roughness at those wavelengths are the ones I care about.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yeah.
So do you need to think about it as a grain size distribution, or is that just kind of a proxy for the distribution of like angles of the surface that are gonna be reflecting?
For like the bed forms, because I think that there are some relationships, I think in the literature that relate grain size to bed form, but it's not just that. There's other things that will affect the size of the bed forms. It's not just the grain size.
Or I guess in terms of scattering, is it the grain size itself that it's affecting it, or is it sort of like the angle of the bed, which is dependent on the grain grain size, but if you can directly measure the angle of like what you're hitting.
So there's multiple things, there's both the angle it's hitting, and so that's gonna be like the large scale topography, the larger scale, and then it's the roughness of the surface itself, which is at the acoustic wavelength that you're sending out. So let's say it was flat, but you had a lot of roughness, it's gonna scatter differently than if it was flat but no roughness. But then the bed forms adds like another scale to that. So you kind of, one of them changes just the angle it hits, and the other one changes the amount of energy that's being scattered back. And both those things can depend on grain size in certain ways. Okay. Tom?
So, great talk, thank you. I remember years in the initial listening to sediment transport, especially Alex, talking about how difficult the problem was.
Yes.
And they always just kick the heterogeneity question instead of just like, look into that someday. Feels like you guys are starting to get at that. So he started working on sediment stuff and then he retired and he was like still working on it. He was like made all this progress in the way. So it's an incredibly difficult problem, feels like to me.
I agree. I think this is multiple lifetimes of multiple people working
You have
on it.
new tools now, you've got better models, you've got better ways of looking at things, and just more data to look at, but. So I don't even know where to start with questions, I've just got a whole list of them. So maybe the one I'm most interested in is you look at the seafloor, which is changing because of the combined wave and current boundary layers. So currents and waves
Yes,
interacting
yes.
to create bed forms, it's the combination of those, so tidal currents or other flows also important, so directionality starts to come into play. And then there's the whole question of the larger scale spatial variability.
Yep.
Looking at one patch in the
Yes.
seafloor, is that the same as this patch right next to it under exactly the same conditions? And you started talking about that with your two cameras that you're gonna put on the next thing. Are there any spatial measurements that you can make from a shipboard system to put your fixed measurements in context, even if it's not continuous, but just map it in
Yeah.
some way with
I
acoustics?
think this relates to Khan's project that he's doing of having his tripod in one spot and then and it's collecting every hour for multiple months, and then having the ship do a survey kind of over it, the same track every month, right? Once a month.
We don't hit the
I would
same
say
spot though.
over it and to around it. Like
Oh,
in
yes, so that would be
spatial,
really,
yeah.
I see what you're saying, like kind of
Not
do
just
a,
that spot, but
yeah.
just around it. And then you might be able to get some idea what the decorrelation timescale
Yep.
of the different forms, how far.
no, that would be great. I mean, I would also love,
Just adds to the complexity of what you see there.
I would love to also just get maybe divers or something, go around it and take pictures, because we're pointing this location, as you said, I don't know if it's the same either way, so at least the two system will address some of those questions, but I agree, more ground truth or other ways to measure the spatial variability around it would be very useful.
Jim's got a nice drop camera.
Yeah, I know, I've talked to Jenna a little bit about making those kinds of measurements, and it could be very useful.
Yeah, thanks.
Alright, you're on the